Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me here. I really appreciate it. I think I am technically the last session of this whole thing, so hopefully you have a little bit of energy left. If not, I'm just going to keep on going anyway. But thank you for being here. From what I've seen, this is going to be a bit of a different session from a lot of the other ones at DockerCon. I am personally, I was an engineer by training, but haven't worked as an engineer for about 15 years. I've been more of a product guy. So I was a coder, turned product manager, turned engineering manager, and sort of other things. And with LLMs, it sort of brought me full circle, where now I'm doing a little bit of everything, and I've been doing a lot of work actually trying to apply these things in real-world use cases. So I'm going to give you a whole bunch of examples and stories, fundamentally. There's going to be a lot of words on these slides. I hope that's not a problem. It's more just to sort of remind me of what stories to tell, so please don't worry too much about the words. But it also allows me to make 2 points at once sometimes, so that's nice. But I'll give you just a little background on me and sort of and the practice that I work with, and then really just dive into some things that we've learned from trying to do these things in the real world. And also, I was mentioning just please, feel free to interrupt with questions. I am totally happy to do that. I think there's enough in here where, like, if something kind of piques your interest and you want to follow up on it, please just raise your hand. We'll try to get a mic to you. And otherwise, I'll just repeat your question back so we can all hear it. But let's get going. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about just Stride. That's the company that I work with and the practice that we've built. And really just sort of the things we've learned so far and some of the practical considerations that we've run into as we've implemented LLM applications. I should say that up front, we don't build models. We are not machine learning people. We've incorporated machine learning into a lot of the applications that we've built. We build custom software, so there's a whole bunch of applications where we've used it, but we are not people who build LLMs. We are people who use LLMs, and we're interested in using it both for our clients to solve business problems and to build better software, right? Both of those use cases are really interesting to us. And then I'll give you a little bit of stuff to chew on in terms of the future. And some of this I've heard coming up at other talks, predictions of kind of what this does to people's workflows. I would love to touch on that and get any questions if you have them. So about us, Debbie, our founder, was on stage this morning at the keynote. We historically were an in-person New York dev shop. And this back before COVID meant we were putting people in seats next to developers at companies who largely were based in New York. We're an XP shop, so we're very much about pair programming, upskilling, educating. When COVID hit, we were able to pivot a lot of that practice into just more generalized delivery, right? So we now can come in for entire projects, we can come in and refactor code bases, any number of things. But we're doing that fully remote, with the headquarters in New York. What we've been doing around LLMs is really a mix of education and practical implementation. You'll see this throughout some of the stories we'll tell, but like nobody outside of the sort of hardest core enthusiasts 100% gets how LLMs really fit sort of with everything else that's going on. So we believe the first thing is like you have to educate, you have to give people something to chew on, you have to sort of try to create an aha moment, because as soon as somebody, and I think you guys have probably had this experience if you've played around with the tools, as soon as you see something happen that like just really resonates with you, you're like, I had no idea that could be done by anything other than a very smart human being. Then it piques your interest and you wonder what else it's capable of, right? But you have to get there first, right? So really a lot of what we've been doing is trying to put together content. We have a crash course, we have weekly posts, we're trying to do some longer form blog stuff, but we also realize that it's overwhelming. You can't follow every single thing that happens, so we're trying to pick out the ones that matter. On the execution side, we have very much invested in proof of concepts and experiments with as many of the buzzy tools out there as you can imagine. We've built a whole bunch of POCs for ourselves, in part so that we could build them for our clients. And then we have done a bunch of work with actual clients in their environments. And so 2 examples here. We did essentially, we had a client who was looking to implement a search engine, but it turned out that really the requirement wasn't for search. It was explain this kind of concept in terms of people. It actually good fit for an LLM. So we quickly pivoted into implementing what was first just a kind of an elastic search into an LLM-powered fuzzy, kind of search experience that was much more explanatory. So it was a great fit. We're really happy to do that. And then the engagement that I just rolled off of was actually a secure implementation, a lot like what I think you've heard Justin and the Docker folks talking about today, an LLM in a box, right? A container, is one way to do it, but we were really just looking at inside a secure cloud, can we stand up an LLM that talks to proprietary data and enables safe experimentation. And you'll hear that theme a bunch, right? That, really the problem is just that people don't know how to get started. The end, people, who are doing, work every day will go use ChatGPT, either as part of their unofficial workflows or just to play around. But the business doesn't acknowledge that. The business is not really taking that and running with it because they don't know how to police chatbots. They don't know how to advise how to use them, right? And the only ones who are fundamentally trying that hard are the big guys who are signing these big multi-year deals to basically say, we'll figure it out, we promise. And so we're trying very much to give a middle ground where you can get some guardrails around things, a safe environment, and then actually learn something. The other thing that I think is really interesting to us and that also fits with our practice. So our practice is probably 80% developers, but we also have an active product and design piece of it. We really think the design has a lot to do with the fact that this stuff hasn't been adopted wholesale inside organizations, right? A chatbot is natural to humans and weird for work because we're all used to interacting with tools that are very particular to our workflows and that actually help us do our jobs, not a super smart thing that interacts via text and is clearly smarter than we are. It's a really weird paradigm. And so there really is a design. So a lot of what we've been trying to do is figure out from a user experience standpoint, what do you need to help people really get the most out of these tools? How do you present it in such a way that they can grab as opposed to hoping that they'll prompt engineer their way into a successful result? So we really think this is an important piece of it. And just a quick testimonial, we really were able to unstick this client who was, I would call it a frustrated enthusiast, right? So this is a guy who, as the CTO of a security company, right, in this case, was absolutely not able to just let loose the power of LLMs on his people. He didn't want to, he couldn't. He was interested in seeing what they were capable of. He wanted to help his people start to understand it, and he needed an environment where he could do that. And so that was the time where we did the sort of secure LLM in a box. It is a combination of learning and outcomes, right? You can't separate the two. At this point, if you deliver an outcome and no learnings, you end up in a very weird spot. And if you deliver learnings without thinking about the outcome, you don't actually get you don't get to phase 2 of the project, right? You need to be able to do both. Okay. Let me jump into some of the learnings. And this is where I'm going to go into story time. So again, feel free to stop me and ask questions about any one of these. Again, lots of words. I will try to give you kind of the story behind them. And I think the first one actually fits pretty well with what we're all doing here. At first, I think what you saw in the market was an explosion of excitement and enthusiasm around open source toolchains, right? The fact that you could take the leak from Llama, right, which happened in February, something like that, and within 2 weeks, there was an ecosystem springing up around it, right? You started to hear about LangChain. You started to hear about the people running LoRa and making these models small enough to fit on a laptop, right? You saw this crazy explosion of hey, we can do this, and it's so exciting, and anybody can jump in and make this happen. And that's true. But when you actually get into what the big clouds are doing, they already had these really robust tool chains around machine learning, right? That this was not something that Amazon or Google or Microsoft were unprepared for. They already offered a lot of this stuff, just not specifically around LLMs. So they were able to take their basic machine learning stuff and adapt it. And this is particularly true for some of the things where, if you're out there reading these tutorials about how to stand up RAG, right? Retrieval augmented generation. You think you need a vector database, and there's a whole bunch of these buzzy startups who are doing vector databases. If you go into AWS, you can actually just use Kendra, which is their search service. It plugs into LangChain. It'll create the embeddings, for Llama 2 if you tell it to. It really just worked, right? And granted, you might want some other solution for performance tuning. There's other reasons you might want to dig deep, but you don't have to. And that was actually a really key learning for us, was that the clouds offer a lot of this stuff well enough that you can get started. And in fact, because these are Amazon managed services in this example, they scale pretty well. So you really don't have to worry about it. So that's one big thing. That said, there are some use cases that go beyond what you're going to get out of the box. And actually, one of the ones here that was interesting was when you spun up the default model for Llama 2 in SageMaker, which is Amazon's machine learning platform. You get something that works, but the API is, it doesn't stream, right? So we're all used to talking about GPT, and it sort of speaks one character at a time, user experience, sort of convinces you that it works. It turns out that the Llama 2 you get off the rack doesn't do that. And so, the easy path has limitations. There are ways around those limitations. And actually, this one here, the most interesting thing about this Hugging Face approach is that it's built on Docker. They basically just came up with a framework sitting on top of Docker that allows you to swap in a new container that does support the server sent events, right? That's the thing that you need to do streaming, and supports kind of whatever model you want. It's not the one Amazon recommended, but it totally fits, right? You just have to know that it's an option. So, these kinds of things, every cloud is going to be a little bit different, but in general, assume that someone, inside the big platforms has figured a lot of this out, because largely they have. So on the data side, and I'm talking, about a lot of implementations as assuming that sort of they're in this RAG pattern, which just means that you have an LLM, and you have an application that talks to it, and you have some data store. And with every question, you're able to pull back relevant data and kind of include it in the context. So that is a really powerful pattern. That's what people mean when they say an LLM that can talk to your data. They're talking about RAG. The thing that we discovered was that it is easy to just say, oh, just take all my stuff. Here's my Google Drive. Suck it in, pick out whatever you think is relevant. That will work until you realize that there are files in your Google Drive that are out of date. And guess what? The LLM has no idea. It assumes that everything's right. So you've now poisoned the well, and you can't tell what's right and what's wrong. And so we saw much, much better results by just telling people, no, you got to pick the 5 most important files you think this thing needs to know about, feed those in, and then if you want to add new things, do them one at a time. It's worth your investment to do that. I think there are cases, and I heard folks talking about this earlier today, there are cases with things like code generation. You want to give it the good code as an example, not necessarily the bad code. Maybe it needs to know about the bad code, but you don't want to tell it all of this code is equally, sort of appropriate to our standards. It may not be, right? You may want to actually give it the bad code and ask it to rewrite it, right? So you have to be clear about sort of what you believe is sort of, this thing learning from. So that's one thing. The other one is just that it is impressive how simple the UX is for these things, and yet how opaque certain parts of it are. And so what you have to realize is that when you spin up a chat box and you just say oh, just ask your question, behind that question is a bunch of stuff. There are prompts that even we as model users can't see, which are things like, don't tell anybody how to build bombs, no overtly, sort of awful language. There's a bunch of things that these are pre-instructed for. But then the second that you give it RAG data, right? So this is, if you're going to provide context, there's usually a prompt that comes along with that context that says, you need to answer the question specifically based on this context I'm about to give you. Don't make anything up. If you don't see it, if you don't see the answer in this context, say nothing. Basically say, I don't know. But that's not obvious to end users, right? It's not something that is intuitive even, for any of us who work with it. So you need to know that there are settings, there are prompt pieces. The actual full context of what goes to an LLM for every question it's asked is much larger than what you usually see. And I remember seeing in the theater, giving an example of this around building a RAG model against LangChain and I think it was Olama and I forget who else. But so that is very, very true that all that stuff is happening. You as a developer should be aware of it, right? So build yourself a debug mode. Right? I don't know, this can be a checkbox or a button or whatever. Build yourself a debug mode where you can see these things. So if you get weird results, you can ask. You can say okay, well, is this because I set the temperature at a different setting? Is this because this prompt, clearly says, don't be creative when, I was hoping it would be more creative. You can also sometimes ask the LLM to explain itself. That just doesn't always work. So let's be aware that it's an option, but it doesn't always work. Okay, so now flipping over. The most interesting thing about this, honestly, is how people have sort of reacted to it. And I'll tell a couple stories here in this first one. We were building this secure LLM, right, for the security company. And the CTO introduced us to a group who was sort of outside of his core group. And they had a really compelling use case for LLMs. It was web scraping in this case. It was, essentially, I want to keep our internal data up to date with some of these external data sources, right? I need to make sure that I know, kind of all the latest updates, and that I don't have to rebuild my entire scraping logic every time something changes, right? And in this case, we had a sandbox for them. We said, hey, why don't you try this, right? Why don't you feed in, some of your web data? and we'll see if we can parse it, right? Because that was their problem, was the parse was brittle, and every time something would change, it would break, and they'd have to go fix it, right? Maybe LLMs can do that better. So the first time we tried, and this is actually a story I'll get to in a second. The first time we tried, it was mediocre. Like, it sort of, it gave like a partial answer. It was like half correct. The second time, it was a little better. And the third time, they got frustrated, and they were like, well, can you just go to this URL, right? Like, just go to this URL and like look at the thing, and maybe you can just see it, and then that'll tell us the answer. And the third time, it got it right. But it got it right for a very perverse reason. In the URL was an acronym that we had included in the RAG sources, right, as an acronym that they should know about. And it turned out that it basically looked at the URL structure, correctly guessed what the page was about, and they were like, oh my God, it works. Guess what? It didn't work. It can't see the internet, right? I mean, we all, I think, intuitively know this, that the LLMs are not internet connected by default. But these guys really were assuming that it was in sort of all the natural ways, and it gave them the right answer even so, right? So we had to go back and say, like, hey, this is a very teachable moment. This thing can't talk to the internet yet. We can probably get there. But what you needed to do was actually just to give it the original scraped data and give it more precise instructions, right? Evolve the prompt, not completely change your approach, and with a better prompt there. So again, I'll give a bit more of an example of that in a little bit. You need people to be aware of this stuff and educated enough about it to be effective, because otherwise, they're going to draw the wrong conclusions, right? And especially at this point, you can't afford that, right? People need to know what is and isn't possible. And we already talked a little bit about this, but chat as a UX is way too vague for most people, right? So those of you who worked with prompt engineering, the reason that that's a thing is because you really don't have any context other than you can ask this thing questions and it'll respond, and then you have to get progressively sort of more detailed with how you set the context, because you will get better answers that way. Most people don't have patience for that, right? Most people either don't think that's a good use of their time, or the learning curve on just figuring that out is steep enough they never get there. So what we actually did in one case here was a targeted use case, a constrained use case, using the secure LLM we had, but building something that would answer infrastructure questions. It was one of their core technical problems. Like, how do I get a certain kind of resource provision in AWS? How do I fix certain problems that are common? Even down to stuff like, what does this HTTP code mean? Which anybody, including Google, can answer, right? But these coming to the info all the time and overloading them. By constraining it and saying, this bot will answer your infrastructure questions, and if it doesn't know, it will tell you who does. That was all very achievable inside this kind of constrained, RAG-driven context. Then the process side. The main thing that we've run across this a lot, also just in the context of non-technical engagements. So we've worked with a handful of clients where we're not going in to build them an LLM. They're fine using ChatGPT. That's no problem. But they still can't get the kind of business impact they want, in part because the way you introduce this to your organization is really important, and it varies a lot, right? I mean, there's right ways to do it, and I think there are a few wrong ways. But in particular, what you need to do is look at it as a ground-up, sort of operation. If it comes from the top down, that says two things to people. It says, I can only do with this what you tell me I can do, because otherwise I'm going to get yelled at, and you're probably going to replace me with this at some point, right? If it comes from the top down, that's the message that sends. Whereas if you do it from the ground up, what you're really saying is, hey, we don't know exactly what this is going to do to all of our workflows, right? We don't. We believe it's powerful. We want you, as an employee, to be empowered to figure out what improvements you can make to your own workflows. And when you make those improvements, we want to congratulate you for it. We want to incentivize you to come up with good improvements, right? Because it will enable all of us to do better work, or more of the work that we want to do. That tone can be set. We've seen people set it. And then we've seen something kind of in the middle where the CEO gets super excited about something, right? And fundamentally, they're right about it. They're like, hey, you can use this to do so much interesting stuff. We can do better marketing campaigns. We can have a more interesting product. And they're right. They're excited about all this stuff. But they're also then sort of giving that mandate to a team who's already busy, who isn't sure, sort of what's in it for them, who's a little worried that if they actually change all of their workflows and they screw it up, they're going to get punished. Even though the CEO was like, hey, I'm excited about this. Why don't you try it? There was no ill will in any of this. The CEO was totally doing the right thing. It just still got stuck, right? And that's really getting unstuck is, I think, the focus of a lot of the work that we're doing. And the last one, which I think it's a subtle point, but we have seen this a couple times. we've seen teams who are actually really, really excited about LLMs, like to the point of making real investments, implement an LLM and get halfway down the road and then stop, right? Basically get to the point where they weren't able fundamentally to get the result they wanted, in part because they didn't think that what they were seeing was effective enough, right? They were basically like, this doesn't do the entire job, and therefore it's no better than just having humans to do it, right? Like, I haven't actually gained anything. This isn't ready. And our advice was like, no, you're totally misunderstanding this. That is an 85 to 90% improvement, and it means that you can do a lot more of the interesting stuff that only people can do. You could do more of these things you're trying to do. You could do different things that are fundamentally leveraging this capability that you could never do before. So you can go further than the use case you're trying to replace. And I think most people will see that once they sort of really chew on the problem. But instinctively, with these new technologies, you basically start by trying to replace the work you're already doing. You only rethink your workflow after you're comfortable with that, right? And so this is an easy place to get stuck. People basically saying, well, it's not ready. I can't do exactly what I'm already doing today. I'm just going to keep my status quo. All right. I did want to talk a little bit about Copilot for those who've used it and those who haven't also. So that this is GitHub's AI-powered code assistant. In our experience, the autocomplete is fine. The pull request tool is actually very good. So that's the one that honestly to us was the biggest slam dunk. Like it's very, very good at describing your changes. That's work you don't have to do as a developer. Chat was a mixed bag, right? The chat is very much, it should work. It should be a good thing because it's, by definition, in Copilot, it's next to your code, right? It theoretically has context on your code. It can see whatever you're seeing. And that means less copy and paste. It can make file structures for you. If you tell it, I want to make a new project, it'll scaffold it. Like, those are great things. But honestly, you get better results just talking to GPT-4 outside of Copilot, right? And I think there's a few reasons for that. I think fundamentally, Copilot is intentionally constrained. And this, if that's a hot take, we don't have any proof of this, but I very much believe Copilot is marketed as a programmer's assistant, right? They say, you are in control. You as a developer are in control. That's part of the marketing message. I think what that means is that there are certain things that would enable Copilot to do more for you that it is prohibited from doing, because that would really fundamentally change the relationship, right? If Copilot can look at an entire repo and refactor it for you, which is something I personally really want to do, like there are a bunch of use cases I can think of for that, it won't do it. I've tried a bunch of different ways. It literally will not do it. You try to make it use web browsing to scan a repo, it can only go one level deep, right? And there's a bunch of reasons for that too. They don't want people scraping entire websites. But these limitations are all largely artificial. So the good thing is it means that OpenAI and Microsoft are being careful. The bad thing is that we're not really getting, I think, to reckon with the true possible change here, right? Which is that you could have a really effective code pair who is fundamentally able to do almost all the coding for you, and then you can focus on the things that are higher value. So I just want to put that out there. We're like, these are artificial limits. They're not wrong necessarily, but I think we should be aware that they're artificial. And then there are going to be some upper bound things where you're not going to be able to throw 10 million lines of code at these things right now, right? You have to subdivide and break your problems down. But that's true for humans. Okay, humans can't read 10 million lines of code and keep it in their head either, right? So it's a process problem, not necessarily a technical problem. Okay, and just a couple of fun anecdotes. So the first one, when we did our secure Llama 2, we had a bug and we weren't passing the prompt through, where we were basically saying, hey, you're an assistant who helps with questions around this company's data. And then we started asking a question of the company's data, and it responded, and correctly, but with like links and emojis and all this other stuff. Like literally out of the box, it Llama 2, it talked. And so try this yourself. Like it may not be deterministic. I can't guarantee this will happen for you, but it did happen for us. So that was kind of a fun one. And then this is the one that I think is much more compelling. You remember earlier I was talking about this web scraping example, right? So people were giving basically a snippet of structured text, like a table of in this case I think it was professional license data, right? And so you give a table of that stuff and you say, hey, can you tell me what license this is? When you don't sort of give it any additional prompting, it'll basically be like, oh, I'm not sure, I can't really tell. But then if you literally change the prompt to, you are a bot which is very good at reading professional license data out of tables, it nails it, right? And it's just because you're pushing its predictive framework just that much over the edge to where it believes that if it gives you the right answer, it's going to get better feedback. So remember that that's the thing that's behind all of this, is that the model is not trying to actually solve your problem. The model is trying to predict whatever is going to get the best positive feedback. And so if you tell it, you can do this, it is more likely to actually do it. That's just a reality of these things right now. So bear that in mind. It can still be wrong, right? It's wrong a lot of the time. But literally, there will be times where it won't even try because it doesn't believe the reward is there. So just fascinating. OK, I'm going to go quick through this because I want to leave time for questions, and I realize we're almost at 20 minutes left. So really, I just wanted to sort of put a couple things out here about the enterprise. So we have definitely seen, we work primarily with larger and mid-sized enterprise clients. There are some really important things that are holding back adoption, right? And these were the three that I picked out. Security is kind of intuitive, but auditability and testing are pretty important too. And really, with explainability, think about a regulated industry who has to respond to an auditor about how they made certain decisions, right? And this is true for HR use cases. It's true for almost anything that has any kind of fairness implications. You need to be able to explain how you got where you got. On the one hand, we believe this is a model vendor problem. They're going to have to come up with solutions themselves. We don't know what those are yet. And some of them can be technical. I don't know if anybody's read about like hyperdimensional vectors. There's some really weird stuff out there that theoretically goes to, here's exactly the neuron that was activated in coming up with this response, and here's what it means. There are things like that. But in the meantime, to some degree, what you really have to do is just create a process around it, select models where you can ask them for their thought process. How did you get here, right? Like, tell me, show your work, right? There are models that are better at that. And that can really help. And then you just really do have to put an operationalizing layer around it. The testing side, on the one hand, I think there's a bunch of scholarship out there about, you test models by having other models assess them. That's a pretty common pattern that we've heard and seen a little bit of. And we also are seeing a little bit now of real observability tools. So I think you might have seen a demo on stage of Langsmith earlier. We've played with that a little bit. Very cool tool. Plugs into LangChains. That actually gets you pretty good coverage across a lot of the applications you might build. And then the big guys like Datadog are coming out with suites that are, I think, going to be pretty interesting. And right now, you can get some data out of the clouds also, like SageMaker and others will tell you things about your LLMs. But this is essential, right? If people can't really see these things, it's also going to hold back adoption. So I think that's a really important piece. Our recommendation here is also just to use the sort of basic things that you can do around the models as much as possible. So for us, that's TDD. We're very much a TDD and XP shop, as I mentioned before, I think. You can test everything around the model itself, and then you can have observability and other sort of things that help you look inside the model. And I really do believe TDD is a big thing when you actually start to rethink the process for software, right? That is a really important element. So for security, the main thing I was going to mention is just, and this again is a story from experience. You do have to very specifically draw some lines. And one line, right, is your chatbot is going to generate logs. If you give this to your HR team, and your HR team doesn't have very, very clear guardrails, there may be sensitive HR matters that end up in the logs of your LLM. This is not necessarily a career-ending error, but hey, you never know, right? So be careful. There are cases where the policy around LLMs is important enough that you either need to explicitly, warn people off through the user experience, make very clear, when they're using this thing, what is and is not OK. A bunch of ways to do it, but it's a concern. And it needs to be something where it's not that everyone is so scared they're just going to get hauled before a board, but they are aware that it's a problem, right? This is a company, the corporate, sort of normal guardrails apply. And locally hosting inside the VPC is helpful if any of this is a concern. But you also do have an option with Azure. You can get an Azure-hosted GPT-4. If no one's aware of that, right? You can use OpenAI and use their APIs. That's fine. But if you don't want to do that, if you are an Azure client or willing to be one, Microsoft has a hosted version, which is going to be more secure and have higher guarantees for you. OK. I wanted to throw out a couple of predictions, in part just to build on what we were just talking about in terms of the software process. So the first thing is, I really believe that the LLM UX that is going to be most interesting to all of us next is not going to be a chatbot. We're all excited, myself included, about GPT-4 with vision. That's super cool. Still a chatbot, but fascinating in its own way. I think that there is more coming that has nothing to do with chat, right? But still leverages the fundamental. These are models that are starting to be multimodal. They can see, they can hear, they can think. There's a whole bunch of interesting use cases. And I think chat was just the first one that kind of cracked the door open. The second one is about TDD. So if you think about it this way, and again, I'm making these statements intentionally pretty provocative. If the code passes the tests and meets the requirements, do you care who wrote it? Right? I mean, in some cases, maybe you do, but I would argue there's a lot of cases where you don't, right? And does it even need to be good code? Maybe, maybe not. Depends if you're maintaining it or not. If you're not maintaining the code, and all it needs to do is pass the tests, and in fact, maybe the next time you want to change it, you throw it all away, it changes a lot about the workflows. It really makes you rethink what steps you need, what guardrails you need. And in fact, I would argue that what you're really going to try to do is create a bunch of layers around the outside of it. You're going to take for granted that you can't control exactly what comes out of the LLMs, but that if it passes certain tests, if you can run a pen test against it, if you checked it for backdoors, like that there's going to be ways you get confidence and trust around these things that makes it possible for humans to not really be reviewing much or any of the code, right? So that really is coming. And to that point, I think really this affects so much about the life cycle, right? Everything we do today is predicated on human handoffs. Right? Everything we do is creating artifacts that then allow you to pass requirements and business outcomes all the way through to get code and all the way back again, right? And to have testing and observability and security and all of that. All of that stuff is because you can't have one person writing large systems. Well, guess what? This kind of changes that, at least in some ways. It's not there yet, but I think it's coming faster than maybe we think. Cool, and so really I just wanted to sort of leave with our method for this. Combination of education, and then we do have this thing which is pretty interesting around just getting people started, but not purely technically, right? Doing a stand-up of basic technology as part of it, but also you have to talk about use cases, right? Again, if you do the technical bit and you don't think about the outcomes and how you're going to explain this to the guy who writes the checks, it's not going to work, right? And you're not going to get the kind of buy-in you want. And likewise about design and about really trying to meet your users where they are. And then just as a last thought, there's a lot of interesting people out there to read. I know it's a fire hose, but here's a few of the ones that I like the best. So with that, I think I'm done. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate the attention. If anybody has any questions, we do have a few minutes. Cool. Any questions? Anything I can go deeper on, or any stories of your own to share?
How do you feed enough data into an LLM without bumping up against the token limit?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's really just about breaking down your process in such a way where you're doing pieces at a time. But at the same time, in practical usage, you don't run up against the limits all that much, right? Like, you can have long conversations, especially with ChatGPT. You can have very long conversations with whole swaths of code or data files, whatever, pasted in, and it doesn't choke, right? It doesn't ever get to a point where it's too much. And you're seeing also with a bunch of the models that are off the shelf, people are going and reformulating them. I think it's long LoRa, I think, is one of the techniques. But you're able to lengthen the context window just by changing the way that it looks at the embeddings. And so you can have a Llama, I think it was Llama 213B with like a 100,000 token limit, with that kind of approach. So technically there are ways to get around it. In practice, you don't usually run up against them all that much, at least in my experience.
So what are your thoughts on reinforcement learning with AI in the loop? There's a paper recently for that approach.
Yeah, well, sorry, reinforcement learning with AI in the loop?
Yeah.
Well, so I think this came up a little bit earlier too, just about the idea of in the end, is all the data going to be AI generated, and therefore we start to lose, the human feedback piece. So fundamentally, I think that's a real risk, and at the same time, it really is just about us defining what it means to have someone in the loop, right? And so I think the idea of, humans reviewing or contributing essentially their own data in very different ways than we do today. It could be that there are entire things where AI is the only keyboard that touches anything, and other ones where humans are providing just enough new novel data that it sort of applies even to those use cases that are all AI. So like, I mean, it's a risk, but at the same time, like one kind of provocative viewpoint I've heard is at some point, and this is already kind of Facebook being a free product works, we're just going to pay humans to generate data because that's literally the only value we have, right, is being human. I don't think that's totally wrong, but just the idea of like that process has value, and right now, Google is spending, I think it was $1 billion a year to generate training data, right? I mean, it's just starting. Like that will become a more mainstream thing. The idea of like humans being there really just to provide their own data feedback. Cool. Anything else?
What people are doing with the LLMs. Are they building chatbots or are they doing other things?
So of the use cases we've seen the most of, and we've talked to more people than we've actually built for, right? So we do have some experience just in hearing people's ideas. The idea of, so here's one from the ed tech space. So that search case that I was talking about is a good one. In this case, a lot of the problem was they were trying to introduce a new methodology to teachers, right? Here's a new way to think about these concepts and to explain kind of the method that we want master teachers to utilize, right? And so in that case, it was very much a translation problem, right? So it was the chat piece was actually downplayed by the idea of like this is just a whole new content set they didn't have, right? They needed to create, sort of new approach to explaining themselves, right? They could give the basics, they could sort of give a sheet of all the principles, but then every sort of ask would be a little bit different, so you couldn't produce content for every single unpredictable ask. I think chat is the most common one because people can intuitively, see how, generating content is a big part of a lot of people's workflows, code or otherwise, and so chat still, I think, is pretty dominant. One of the big things that we are starting to hear about is people trying to rethink their software workflows a little bit, right? And basically saying, well, does this mean that, I can visually design something and generate code from it, right? So not a chat use case, I have a Figma file, can you make me React, right? That is, I mean, we've seen a bunch of POCs out there that do that, right? So chat, that kind of general, generate anything kind of use case, and a lot of synthesis. So there are a lot of people who used to be doing more conventional machine learning and are now basically saying, well, what I really would like is for end users who are not data analysts to be able to ask questions in English and get back interesting insights, right? So, very related to the chat case, but like much more, don't generate anything, find me a pattern, do the thing that, used to take, an army of dashboard builders and, make it English. Those are the most common. And I think honestly, like, people uncover more as they go, but like the basic idea of like, I have a model I can interact with, whether it's via chat or eventually via images and other things, that's the baseline. All right, well, thank you guys. Any other questions, feel free to come up and chat with me. Also, that is my LinkedIn code. If anybody wants to connect and chat about this more, I am happy to do that. Thank you.